Chapter 3 Hall of Bones. My uncle loves animals, the prince said dryly as the girl stared at the scene before her. He tries to give them room, and the foods they prefer, and companionship. The ones that don't thrive in captivity he sends back to their homes. She should have realized that the man who showed such devotion to his birds might pay similar attention to other creatures. While the animals here were contained, they had far more space in which to move than she had seen in the royal menagerie when she had first arrived in Tortle. Lions basked in the sun, living at the bottom of a well too deep for escape. A lively brook flowed through the enclosure, and desert trees grew on one side, offering shade from the midday sun. Chimpanzees raced around an immense cage equipped with a large, many-branched and leafless tree for their enjoyment. On an island in the middle of a deep pond, strange reddish-faced monkeys Kadar identified as macaques climbed over and around heaped rocks. Giraffes gazed at her solemnly over a tall iron fence. Dane couldn't help herself. She went to them, hands out, letting the wards on her power fall slightly. Startled, the giraffes dropped their heads low on their impossibly long necks to lip her fingers and say hello, while Zek warned them to behave themselves. "It's all right," the girl told him, smiling as the young giraffe snuffled her tunic. "They're grazers. They won't hurt you." "We don't have anything like that where I come from," the marmoset replied with offended dignity. "We have proper animals there." Kadar, who had been taken aside by a keeper, rejoined her. "Has your king anything this good?" Dane bristled at the smugness in his voice. The hot reply on her lips was cut off by Herelt. "Actually, we're trying something a bit uncommon." He gave Dane a half wink. "We Royal University mages are working with builders on a new kind of menagerie, a bit like this one, but much broader in scope. We duplicate the lands each animal comes from, plants, weather, and all. You see where the mages come in. When it's done, within the confines of the Royal Menagerie, a guest will visit small pieces of Carthage, and the Copper Isles, and Scanra." Kadar's eyes lit with enthusiasm. As he pelted Herelt with questions, Dane wandered down the curving path with Zek and Kitten, out of sight of the others. Here she discovered a pit in which giant long-nosed pigs drowsed in a deep pond. Their noses, shorter than an elephant's but nearly as flexible, pointed toward Dane as she passed. Opposite them, a colony of mongooses watched her from behind wire mesh that enclosed a high and far-reaching mound of burrows. Beyond them, the path took an abrupt left turn. This last enclosure lay below ground level, inside a glassy wall 4 yards down from the girl's feet. The area was less well-kept than the others. A small pond lay near the wall, but much of the water in it had evaporated. The grass was brown-edged and lay in patches on bare, dusty-looking ground. The remains of shattered bones lay everywhere. And back, lying out of the sun in a shallow cave, were 3 shaggy, spotted brown hides. She opened a wider crack in her magic's defenses, reaching for these strangers. "Please come out," she called aloud. A twitch of movement. 3 rounded pairs of ears came to bear on her. "You smell of cold places," one voice, commanding and female, said. "You smell of frozen rain and pine trees. You smell of far away. Me and my boys never had a whiff of someone like you." Blinking huge eyes in the sunlight, the speaker came to the foot of the wall. She was followed by 2 smaller males. Dane wished she could meet the god who had molded these creatures. There was a god with imagination. The source of the shattered bones had to be those powerful jaws, equipped with strong teeth. The least of these creatures weighed more than she did. On their 4s, they were tallest and heaviest at the shoulder, their spotted fur covering slab-like muscle. Their hindquarters were low and short, but strong. Small tails sported Johnny tufts at the end. "They're beautiful," she breathed. "Spotted hyenas," Numer said at her elbow, "from the grass plains of Ecalatum, far to the south. Night hunters for the most part. See the eyes? They have the strongest bite of any mortal predator. It crushes even the bones of water buffalo. Hyena packs are matriarchal." What?" she asked. Kin voiced an inquiring whistle of her own. Numer smiled. "Their society is ruled by females. Each pack is led by sisters." "Sensible of them," Dane said, grinning up at him. "Excuse me." It was Varys. She bore down on them with a brittle-looking smile. "I'm sorry. These animals aren't to be shown to visitors. I don't know why the Emperor keeps them when he doesn't even like them. Numer, Dane, please come back. There's another part of the menagerie you haven't seen. Linking her arm through Numer's, she led him away from the hyenas. Come back sometime, offered the female hyena. Me and my boys are always around. I'll do my best, Dane promised. Come on, Kit. When she caught up to the rest of the group, the prince led them through a second barred gate. This is my uncle's other collection, he announced. Each and every one was captured and brought here for causing trouble for humans. Kitten screeched. Dane hushed her, but felt like screeching herself. The cages in this wide courtyard, none of them as pleasant as those for the mortal animals, held immortals. Brass plates on each cage identified killer unicorns, griffins, the flesh-eating winged horses called huroks, and giant lizard-like hunters known as coldfangs. Here, too, she saw unlikely combinations of human and animal. Giant human-headed spiders called spidrins, and centaurs of both peaceful and blood-hungry kinds, the former with hooves and hands, the latter with talons. To her surprise, one cage held a man and a woman with steel-feathered wings and claws instead of arms and legs, stormwings. The male had a pale, intense face, aquiline nose, and fixed, hungry eyes. The female's nose was hawk-like, her dark eyes imperious. She had been beautiful in her youth, it was plain, and now, older, she was haughty and commanding. Dane looked at Kadar. I thought your uncle was allied with the Stormwings. He is, replied Ozorn's nephew. The price of the pact with the Stormwing King Jakon was that Queen Barza and her mate Habek be kept here. Believe me, she would have caused as much havoc in Karthik as Stormwings have in the north if my uncle had not made the alliance. Dane was trembling. What do you feed them? She asked, shaking off someone's restraining hand. Do you bring folk in and scare them so they can live on that? And these cages are too small. The griffin can barely open its wings. Kin muttered unpleasant things in Dragon. They don't need food, and they don't require more room, said Varys impatiently. You know these monsters don't fall ill and die. Unless you kill one, they live forever. Would you rather let them raid villages and destroy crops? We mean no criticism of the way the Emperor chooses to run his domain, said Duke Gareth. His eyes locked on Dane with a message she couldn't ignore. She looked at her shoes, biting her lip before more rash words spilled out. Dane speaks only because her bond with all creatures gives her a dislike of cages. Your Highness, my lady, I regret to say I am not as young as I was. Might we find some place shaded and sit for a moment? Your sun is fierce, even this early. Their group streamed out through the gates. Dane alone hesitated, staring at these captives. She had no reason to like spidrins, stormwings, huroks, coldfangs, and their kind. Too much of her time in Tortle had gone to fighting immortals like these. Stormwings in particular had caused her personally a great many problems. She ought to be glad these were locked up away from doing more harm. Oughtn't she? At mid-morning she returned to her rooms to find an old servant woman there, straightening things. Don't mind me, she said, her grin revealing a handful of teeth. You sit down. I won't be another minute. She flicked a duster over one of the carved screens. Awkward and unsure of what to say, Dane sat on a chair. She guessed this was a slave, though she was much older than the other palace slaves that she had seen. The woman's dress was undyed cotton, looped over one bony shoulder and hanging just to skinny knees. She wore straw sandals. Her only ornament, if it could be called that, was a tattooed bracelet of snaky lines that twined around each other. Putting aside her duster, the old woman took the pillow from the bed and plumped it. You're from up north, aren't you? She asked. Up Tortle way? Kitten trotted over and tugged the woman's dress, chattering loudly. Not now, dearie, the slave told her, apparently comfortable with a dragon in the room. I have things to do. Over here, Kit, summoned Dane. The slave laid her hand on Kitten's muzzle. Enough, she said, black eyes dancing wickedly in a seamed face. The dragon was instantly silent. Turning back to the bed, the woman grappled with the slippery comforter. Dane barely noticed Kitten's abrupt silence. Her upbringing got the better of her, and she stood, placing Zek on her seat. Ma had not raised her to sit idle, not when housework was to be done. She had not been raised to let an elder work without aid. Here, grandmother, let me help. Kit, move! The dragon ducked under the chair. Together the girl and the old woman bared the sheets on the bed and began to neaten them. Yes, I'm from Tortle, Dane said. From Gala before that. Your first trip to Carthage? What do you make of us Southerners, eh? Do you like it here? It occurred to Dane that the woman might be a spy, there to get information from her. It's all right, she said hesitantly. It's very different from home, of course. It's in trouble, you know. The Empire. The gnarled old hands were busy, tugging and straightening. Famine in the South, 5 years running. Did they tell you? Locusts, folks out of work, wells drying up. It's as if the gods have turned their faces from the Emperor. It's not my place to say, Dane stammered. You gotta look around a bit. Really look. Long as you're here, priests don't like the omens, you know. They whisper that a cold wind's blowing from the divine realms. Might be next time you visit Carthage. It won't be here. Hard to argue with gods when they're done being nice to mortals. Briskly she patted the coverlet into place. Dane blinked at the woman. Her words sounded too much like what the badger had said. And weren't slaves supposed to be quiet and timid? None of the others had talked to her like this one did. All they'd said was, yes, nobility, no nobility, and right away, nobility. Do you think the gods are vexed with Carthage? She asked, digging her hands into her pockets. The slave ran her duster over the writing desk. Ask them to show you the temples, she advised, apparently not hearing Dane's question. The shrines? They used to be the glory of the Empire. Now they think mages and armies are imperial glory. They think, the Emperor thinks, he doesn't need the gods. Wickedly, she reached with the duster and flicked the end of Kitten's nose as the dragon peered out from under her chair. Kitten sneezed, then squealed with outrage as her scales turned angry red. Her voice rose as she hooted and chattered with fury. Dane begged her to be quiet, but there was no silencing the dragon this time. The girl knelt and clamped her hands on her muzzle. Stop that this instant, she ordered. Look at Zek. You're hurting his poor ears, and you're hurting mine. Kitten glanced at Zek. The marmoset sat gravely on the back of the chair, paws over his ears. Slowly turning a sullen gray, the dragon whistled what sounded like an apology. She wants discipline, remarked the old lady, sounding breathless. Her own folk would never allow her to speak out of turn. Concentrating on Kitten and Zek, Dane had taken her eyes off her visitor. When she turned to ask the servant what she had meant, she discovered that the old woman had dragged the tiger-skin rug out from under the bed and was attempting to stand with it bundled into her arms. Dane's reaction was automatic. Here, grandmother, I'll take that, she said, holding out her hands. Just tell me where it goes. The woman dumped the bundle into Dane's arms, and white light flared. Kitten shrieked as the skin began to writhe. The girl dropped it, horrified. Her head swam, and she toppled over, landing on her hands and knees next to the fur. As she gasped for air, the skin rippled. The great forepaw by her toes flexed. Long razor claws shot out, then resheathed themselves. By her nose, a hind paw stretched, then braced itself on the floor. The rump, no longer flat on the stone, wriggled. Slowly, as if a body filled the empty hide, the cat got to its feet, hindquarters first, then forepaws. The tail lashed. Dane scooted away from it. Grandmother, you'd best get out of here, she cried. The door opened. A slave peered in, seeing first Zek and Kitten by the chair, then Dane. The door hid the rug from her view. The slave knelt and bowed her head, putting her right fist on her left shoulder. You called this unworthy one nobility? No, said Dane. Yes. The slave touched the floor with her forehead. Dane lunged to her feet. Please don't do that, she pleaded, not sure if she spoke to the slave or the tiger. I'm not a nobility, all right? Forgive this one's faults, nobility. What do you need? This unworthy one is here to serve. She took a breath and got herself in hand. Please get up, and where's the old woman? Old woman, nobility? Asked the slave. There is no old woman here. Baffled, Dane looked around. The old servant was gone, feather duster and all. She was just here a moment ago. You must have passed her. She grabbed the door, holding it so that the kneeling slave would have no glimpse of the tiger behind it. She was cleaning in here. The slave looked up. The care of your room is this unworthy one's task, nobility, she said, clearly frightened. It was done some time ago, shortly after the nobilities from the north went with the prince and Lady Varys. Dane thought fast. The old slave must have fled in that moment when the light blazed. No doubt she'd been frightened out of her wits. Dane knew her own knees were decidedly weak. She had to calm down, because now she was scaring this poor girl as well. It's all right, she said, attempting a smile. I I must have been napping and had a dream or something. She looked behind the door. The tiger skin lay on the marble tiles, all four paws tucked underneath, tail curled around his chest. The head rested on the floor, eyes closed. If she hadn't known better, she would have sworn the thing looked smug. Except, of course, that dead animal skins couldn't manage that kind of expression. "Would you do me a favor?" She closed the door so that the slave could see the tiger skin. "This rug, it's very upsetting to have it here. Will you take it away? Far away?" From the look on her face as she rose, the slave was used to odd requests. "Yes, nobility." The rug offered her no more resistance than a blanket might have done. With a last bow, she left. Trembling, Dane said, "Thank you," and started to close the door. "Dane?" Ilana was in the central room outside, dressed for the opening of the peace negotiations. "You'd best hurry or we'll be late for the banquet." Dane winced and shut the door. Between talking to the old slave, having the rug come to life on her, and handling the young slave, she had forgotten she had to clean up and change again. "I don't know how much more excitement I can take," she told Zek and Kitten as she stripped off her tunic and shirt. "To think the king thought I might get bored while I was here." The opening banquet started at noon, a feast of the light, cool foods preferred in warmer lands for daytime. From the talk around Dane, such meals were Varys Kingsford's special pride. It was the kind of thing that had foreigners from all over the eastern and southern lands singing the praises of the Emperor's table. The girls surveyed the bewildering variety of choices and let Zek help her choose. The marmoset was an expert on plant foods, at least. Varys was everywhere, seeing to the comfort of the Tortallan delegation and the foreign ambassadors to Carthage who had been invited to observe the talks on behalf of their rulers. With so many lords to attend to, she didn't appear to notice that Numer barely touched his food. Dane noticed, and felt sorry for her tall friend. Varys had filled his plate herself, heaping it with delicacies like eel pastry, elephant ear soup, and snake medallions in a black bean and wine sauce. It was the worst thing she could have done. Numer's body did not always travel well, particularly not after a sea or river voyage. Usually he spent several days in a new place eating mild, simple foods, the only things he could keep down. He nodded and gave polite thanks when she stopped to ask how he did, but Dane could see a tinge of green around his lips. Luckily, the dogs and cats who served as palace mouse and rat catchers were everywhere, even here in the banquet hall. Dane silently asked 2 dogs for help. When a paw on the mage's knee caused Numer to look down, he saw them at his feet, willing to be fed. The look he gave Dane was filled with gratitude. She didn't see the costly food leave his plate, but she didn't expect to. Numer's hobby was sleight of hand. The dogs she heard clearly. They were delighted with their feast. At last the Emperor led them to the room where the talks would be held. Tables and chairs had been placed in a loose square, and unshuttered windows allowed breezes and garden scents to pass through. The Tortallans, the foreign ambassadors, and the Carthage ministers were given seats, their places marked with nameplates of gold inlaid with silver. Jugs of water, juice, and herbal teas were at all the tables. Carthage scribes sat cross-legged against one wall, ready to take notes, while the Tortallan scribes had their own table, directly behind Duke Gareth's seat. Those who would not take part, such as Lindell Reed and lesser nobles and officials, sat in chairs behind the delegations. Dane sat at the end of her table, uncomfortable even there. Kitten had a stool to perch on beside the girl. Zek hid in his usual place under Dane's hair. Ozorn rose to speak, dressed in a blindingly white robe and green shoulder wrap. His hair, ungilded today, proved to be reddish-brown, though it was still in many fine braids, each tipped with a gold filigree bead. Black paint lined his amber eyes back to his temples. He glittered with gems. "We bid you welcome, representatives of our eminent cousin, King Jonathan of Tortall, and of his queen, Thaeth the Peerless, and of our fellow monarchs and neighbors." His voice filled the room. "This day has been too long in coming. At last we are met in a spirit of mutual aid and support for our lands, so long at odds. Villains conspired to bring us to the brink of war, but wisdom and vigilance have kept us from stepping over. All our hearts desire only peace. Without our knowledge and consent, evil men contrived 4 years ago to steal arcane learning secretly held for centuries. With this ill-gained knowledge, they reversed what the writers of those spells had dedicated their lives to achieve. the banning from our human mortal existence those creatures loosely called immortals, the semi-divine beings who may live forever unless accident or force brings their lifespans to a halt. To our sorrow, our person and our university were blamed for this dreadful misuse of power. Our cousins of Tortle, sore beset by immortals and by those who prey on a land open to attack, felt we were to blame, and who could consent it? Loving freedom and commerce, we kept too little watch on our library, on our shipwrights, on those who hired men and paid them in Carthage gold. To our shame and sorrow, our lack of awareness caused our Tortalan cousins to think we condone the behavior of pirates, bandits, and rogues. Let us now set that matter straight. Let us strive together for peace between our peoples and put aside all past misunderstandings. May the gods bless our endeavors, and may they foster the peace for which we all long. Clasping his hands together, he touched them to his forehead in a kind of salute, and sat down. Duke Gareth rose to make his reply, reading from a letter written to Osborne and his ministers by King Jonathan. Dane hid a yawn under one hand. She might have found the letter more interesting if she had not heard discussions about its contents on the voyage to Carthage. Instead, her mind kept skipping away from Duke Gareth's voice, returning to the tiger-skin rug, or to the badger's visit, over and over. She had mentioned the need to talk to Numa and Ilana on their way to the noon banquet, but she knew it might be some time before they could get the chance to safely hear what she had to say. As the Emperor's guests, most of their time away from the talks would be taken up with entertainments and activities. Both had promised to do what they could, and Dane had to be content with that. If only I knew what the gods had in mind, or when it was going to happen, she thought as the foreign ambassadors read messages from their own rulers. I don't know what Numa or Ilana can do with something bad is going to happen. I don't know even what I would do with it. Once the ambassadors were done, each of Osborne's delegates had a speech to make, followed by a speech from each Tortalan official. Dane's yawns began to come thick and fast. Suddenly a clerk tapped her on the shoulder and passed her a note from Duke Gareth. There is no reason for you to remain for all this. Your presence in Carthage has nothing to do with being bored to death. Why don't you go? No one will mind. Just remember to be changed and ready for the supper banquet this evening, and go nowhere that is not permitted. When she stuffed the note into her pocket, Zek woke from his after-lunch nap. We're done now? He asked, hopeful. That was enough to decide her. Maybe they aren't done, but I am, she told the marmoset. Leaning around Ilana, she caught the Duke's eyes and nodded. He smiled at her, and Ilana gave her shoulder a pat. Kit, the girl whispered. I'm leaving. Come on. The dragon shook her head. She appeared fascinated by the speakers. Dane tugged her paw. Kitten shook her head again. With a shrug, the girl left her and quietly made her way out of the room. Looking back as she let the door close, she saw her dragon climb into the vacated chair. Outside, she found herself in a long breezeway that opened on both sides to gardens. She sat on a marble bench with a sigh of relief, and lifted Zek down into her lap. Amazing how much two-leggers can talk, isn't it? Given that the alternative to speech this time is war, I imagine talk is a little better. Lindell had followed her. He sat on the end of the bench and offered a hand to Zek. Curious, the marmoset went to inspect his fingers. I would like to show you something of interest, something you would not see at home. Unless you had planned to return to the deliberations of the mighty. Goddess, no, she exclaimed with a shudder, and picked up Zek. As they set off through the palace, Lindell said, I wanted to ask, is it true marmosets form monogamous groups in the wild? No one's ever been able to actually observe them in their native wilderness. There are also tales, of course, such as the one that claims they vanish in plain sight and reappear in another part of the forest, which is clearly false, isn't it? Dane, politely waiting for him to finish, realized that he had. Zek says they don't vanish, they freeze. The way their fur is colored, they seem part of the tree, or they zip around to the far side of the trunk and keep it between them and whoever is watching. And yes, they have just one marriage. Zek used to live with his wife and their 3 children before they were trapped. Lindell shook his head. Wild things should remain in the wild. Down this corridor. They now entered the heart of the palace, where throne rooms, reception halls, and waiting rooms were located. Lindell stopped before a large double door that bore a brass nameplate, the Hall of Bones. The handles on each flap were very large bones of some kind. Dane and Zek touched one with curious fingers. What do you know of fossils? The mage asked. They're creatures and plants that lived so long ago no mortals remember them. There are some in the Royal Museum, shells, bat-like creatures, fishes, and such. Numer says there are others, skeletons of huge beasts called dinosaurs, but no one has found any in the eastern lands yet. Quite true, replied Lindell. He spoke a word in a language she didn't know, and both door flaps swung inward. Dane squeaked. Zek darted under her hair. Peering at them from the shadows was a very large skull. 3 horns sprang from the bony face, a short one near the end of its nose, and 2 longer ones that pointed forward over the eyes. "Oh, you beautiful thing," the girl whispered, and went up to it, hardly believing what she saw. She only came as high as one of the large eye sockets. "What is it?" With trembling fingers, she touched the beak-like plate of bone that seemed to be the creature's upper lip. Lindell clapped. Overhead, throughout that immense hall, light globes began to glow. "One of the horn-faced lizards. We call them lizards because they resemble lizards more than other creatures, but they didn't act like our modern reptiles do." Dane blinked up at Lindell, who smiled. "This one is a great 3-horn. All of the horn-faced lizards had some type of facial protrusions. The 3 horns and 1 horns also had a simple or ornate bone frill behind the skull. This fellow was the largest of his family. The others varied from 18 to 20 feet in length." She saw a massive curved fan of bone behind the long horns. "Neck armor?" she asked. The hand with which she touched the skull itched. "Apparently." "And they weren't lizards?" "No. The appearance was reptilian, but most were quite agile and less vulnerable to changes in temperature than modern lizards are. They seem to have behaved more like birds than lizards. We know so much thanks to those seers who were able to look back in time. The real world has little use for them, but in a university they are in great demand." "Nobility." A slave had appeared in the doorway. Lindell went to speak to him. Slowly enough that at first Dane thought she imagined it, the skull turned to train a single eye socket on her. The girl stared at it, appalled. She had missed that flare of white light in the flicker of the overhead globes. "Hold still," she hissed, flapping her hands at it. "Quick moving!" The head cocked slightly to one side, as if to ask why she made such an odd request. Carefully, the dinosaur raised a bony foot and wriggled its 3 toes. "Dane, are you all right here?" asked Lindell. "There's something I must tend to." "I'll be fine," she replied, not taking her eyes from the skeleton. She watched it for some time after the maids left, but the bone's period of movement was over. "That was fun," Zek remarked. "Why were you angry with it? Touch some more of them." "Dead should stay dead," she replied silently and firmly. "I will not touch any of them." To emphasize her point, she thrust her hands into her pockets, where they could start no more trouble, and looked around. To the right of the 3-horn, where the large hall connected with a smaller one, she discovered a far different dinosaur. 10 inches tall, it stood beside a nest of eggs, some whole, some broken. "A mountain runner lizard. We don't know what killed him, but at least we kept him with his nest." Lindell had returned. "There's an adult of his kind standing in guard." Dane looked where he pointed and found a somewhat larger skeleton, 8 feet long, peering at her. They were certainly the same animal, and there did seem to be a protective air about the big one. It stood in front of a doorway that led to a chamber full of smaller dinosaurs. "They almost look as if they could move, don't they?" the mage asked. Dane winced. "How did you fit the bones together?" she asked. "Did you find them like this?" "The process is fascinating," replied Lindell. "It was developed by the School of Bardic Arts and the School of Magecraft. If you understand magical theory, you know that things once bound to one another retain the occult tie, even when separated. Knowing that, the bards and mages create special musical pipes. Played correctly, they call the bones together to form the original owner." Dane nodded. She had seen Numer do the same thing with skeletons at home. Together she and Lindell roamed the collection. Behind the 3-horn she had briefly awakened, she discovered another, smaller 3-horn, whose neck frill was larger and flatter, and whose brow horns curved up, rather than pointed straight ahead. A brass plaque set into the base of his stand identified him as a bull 3-horn, listing his height, weight, and the place where he was found. Following this line of skeleton stands, which ran down the center of this branch of the hall, she discovered other horn-faced lizards, whose neck frills grew more and more ornate. A spiked 3-horn whose frill was topped by large curved spines, the thick-nosed horn-face with extra bone plates instead of a nose horn, and the so-called well-horned 3-horn, who boasted downturned spikes on his frill. None of them were less than 18 feet in length, from nose to tail tip. "Don't you wish you could have seen them when they were alive?" the girl asked Zek. The marmoset, as fascinated as she was, shuddered. Dane translated his answer aloud for Lindell. "Only if they were grass eaters. Even so, I should prefer to see them from the top of a very tall tree." The mage laughed at that. They saw bony-headed skeletons like giant, long-legged crocodiles, covered with back and head spikes and wearing solid bone clubs on their tail tips. All were more than 10 feet long and belonged to a family called armored lizards. They gave way to cousins, plated lizards, each with leaf-shaped plates and spikes running along their backs. These too were giants, ranging from 13 to 30 feet in length. Each one's tail was laden with a collection of spikes that looked like a mace. "There's so much learning here," she remarked softly. "The king's trying to build a university to equal yours, but it'll take years. And when it comes to things like this..." "Once Carthage was famous largely for its treasures." Lindell's voice was equally soft. "It was a citadel of learning, arts, and culture. It still has those things in abundance, but now the army and navy garner the attention of the world and of the emperor." When she glanced to her left, her jaw dropped. The skeleton before her, labeled Great Snake Neck, was 90 feet long. Its tiny head, at the end of an extremely long neck, stared down at her from nearly 25 feet in the air. With small teeth only at the front of a light jaw, and eyes that faced to the sides like the three horns, she knew it was a plant-eater. "A very large plant-eater," she told Zek quietly. The marmoset, who had climbed on top of her head for a better look, agreed. Behind this one she saw other snake necks, though none so large. Near the snake neck was another, frightening skeleton, for all he was only 2/3 as long as his neighbor. His eye sockets faced forward, and his heavy jaws bore a collection of sharp and jagged teeth, marks of a meat-eater. He had cousins too, Dane saw. They found a cluster of duck-billed skeletons and, behind them, dinosaurs who sported odd bony crests on their skulls. One reminded her of a basilisk, only the skeleton had a long, freestanding head knob, like a large bone feather on its owner's head. "Now there's a hat," she remarked. Zek sniffed with disdain. She had viewed nearly 10 crested skeletons when she found a second hole in the rear of the collection. Curious, she ventured inside, Lindell behind her. Here stood a double row of elephants. The 4 closest ones were strange-looking, with hides covered in shaggy fur and tusks curved up in an incomplete circle. The next 4 elephants had 4 tusks, 2 sharp ones on top and 2 smaller ones on the bottom. "Mammoths," Lindell told her. "The world used to be much colder, as I'm sure Numar has taught you. In those days, elephants needed fur." "I don't understand. Were these alive ones? How are they here in their skins? Are they in a magical sleep?" "They were brought from ice fields in the distant south," explained the mage. "They froze to death, and the ice preserved them until we could work the spells to keep them as they are. I use 'we' in a general sense, since they were found a century or 2 centuries ago." Dane stared at the great animals. "You have such wonders here. I almost wish I could stay longer and see them all." "I noticed you said 'almost.' I can't say that I blame you, though I wish that were not the case. I have a feeling we could learn as much from you as you might learn from us." Dane laughed at that. "I doubt it, Master Lindell. I'm just a girl with wild magic when all's said and done. When I leave in 6 days, Carthage won't even remember I was here." Lindell smiled. "But I will remember, and so will the Emperor's birds." "I couldn't ask for more," she said with a grin. Nightfall saw her in a lilac muslin dress and the long sleeveless surcoat that had just come into fashion in the north. Hers was gold silk, as frail as a butterfly's wing, with a beaded hem to make it hang properly. The outfit made her nervous. She was sure that at any moment she would step on the hem and rip it out. She and the adults were in a reception room with floors tiled in squares of night blue lapis lazuli and white marble. The talks were over for the day. While the guests sipped fruit juices and nibbled delicacies, Dane waited for Numar to finish a conversation with the ambassador from Gala. At last the gentleman bowed to him and wandered off. Turning, Numar smiled. "You're becoming a young lady." He brushed a curl from her cheek. "If I'm not careful, you'll be grown and married to a deserving fellow before I realize it." She ignored this as being too silly for comment. "When can we talk?" she demanded. "You've got to find a way somehow. It may be fair important." "It may be?" "I don't know. I'm not sure. She thought for a moment and decided she had to take a chance and give him some clue as to what she wanted. I spoke to the Badger yesterday. That startled him. Where? Aboard ship, in my cabin. He was... She groped for a phrase. Not himself. Long brows drew together. Not... The door swung open. Very well, I'll try to develop some opportunity, he said quickly. They've scheduled these meetings so tightly we barely have time to scratch, let alone talk. The group of people surged forward, taking them with it. In the banquet hall, the Emperor waited beside a long, low railing made of gold. Behind it, open windows gave a view of the sky and a small lake. Osborne was as splendid as on the night before, although his theme now was silver, from the beads on his hair to the paint on his eyelids. His long underrobe was silver cloth. Over it he wore a black velvet drape like a cloak that covered his back to the knees and left one shoulder bare. Strings of flashing opals linked the free end of the drape to his wrist. He blazed with gems at fingers and toes. Silver armlets like giant snakes wound about his wrists. Now, through the windows, 2 stormwings dropped in to perch on the gold bar. One was an older male with a pinkish-gray face, tight lips, and small brown eyes. He wore a black iron crown on thinning dark hair. The younger male was green-eyed and lean-faced. He wore bones braided into his long blonde hair. While Osborne and the crowned male spoke privately, the younger one shifted from foot to foot, clearly not pleased to be there. Newmer frowned. Dane, isn't that from Dunlath? None other, she said. The last time she had seen the green-eyed Stormwing, he had been in her bow sight. How nice for us all. We can have a reunion.